Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. I want to come right out the gate and talk to you about the Steelers and free agency and the big move that they made for a team that's never really much of a mover or a shaker in the free agent market. They come right out the gate on day one and start talking to tight end Ladarius Green, officially announced him on day two as signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers for what I feel is a very team-friendly deal with a low upside guarantee. A 4-year deal pans out to about $20 million with about $5 extra million as a signing bonus. Most of Steelers Nation will remember Ladarius Green from when the Steelers played in San Diego this past season. That was also the first game that Antonio Gates had come back, and Green was playing behind Antonio Gates for much of his career thus far. Had his biggest breakout year last year when Gates himself was suspended for 4 games. So he's going to crawl out of the shadow of Antonio Gates and come to Pittsburgh, where I said there wasn't a huge need to replace Heath Miller, but Ladarius Green adds yet another dimension to the Steelers' offense, a big body, almost like another wide receiver out there that teams are going to have to account for when Pittsburgh's offense is on the field. Now, listening to it yesterday on 93.7 The Fan, listening to the Cook and Poni show, and Andrew Fillipponi was riding solo. And I think during this time of the year, a lot of us have really no content, nothing to speak of when it comes to pro football, and especially with our own team. So when we get one piece of news, you got to make it stretch. And Andrew Fillipponi, who Cook and Poni I respect a whole lot, and they have a fantastic show. I recommend to any of you that happen to be listening to me, which I thank you for being one of my listeners, you should go over and check out their show. It's broadcast on weekdays every morning, and they also have archive shows on their website and all over as far as a distributed podcast. But when Poni took, on Thursday when the news was leaked, Poni was excited. He was happy. He thought this was a good move. But on Friday, he took the counter position of why this might not be a good move. And I'm not going to hang it all on Andrew Fillipponi because he did take some callers, and, you know, you're going to answer the questions that the callers come in with. But one of the comments that Poni had made was that Ladarius Green was an expensive toy. And if you go back to my analogy about taking my daughter to the toy store in a previous episode, I had said the top of the line when it comes to the dolls that she likes are the Disney princesses. And there's multiple Disney princesses, but you could only get one, if you could get one. And the position that Poni was taking was maybe he'd be upset, and maybe I'd be upset too, if the Steelers spent some of this money on Ladarius Green on a tight end that they might have been able to get by with maybe Matt Spaeth and Jesse James, and they didn't really need someone that, you know, it's questionable as to if they're a good blocker. We hear all kinds of things this time of the year. When you sign a free agent, you're not going to say, oh, well, you know what, that guy, he's not good. No, you're gonna build him up, and then he gets torn down later as to whether or not this was a good signing when they get on the field and actually play the games. But the position that Poni was taking was, could we have used this money to sign a player in the secondary and make the secondary better? Because the Steelers were 30th in passing, and you've heard me say that multiple times. And for a team that's usually not active in free agency, was this an unnecessary signing? Was this a luxury item and something that they didn't need to do? And he starts to go through some of the teams that have played in the Super Bowl over the last few seasons. And he says those defenses have nicknames, so you should have spent the money on a corner or a safety, because the Steelers were 30th and giving up passing yards. Only the Saints and Giants were worse. Well, when you look at it that way, it kind of unnerved me that you're going to try and say, well, the Broncos have the no-fly zone and the Seattle has the Legion of Boom. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but you look at where their money was spent, and you're going to say, well, the Denver Broncos, they had this great defense, and that's why they won the Super Bowl. Well, that is true. But if you look at it on the other end of the spectrum, what did that no-fly zone nicknamed defense of the Denver Broncos do against the Pittsburgh Steelers? Without Le'Veon Bell, without Antonio Brown, without D'Angelo Williams in a playoff game, they are a fumble away from a street free agent picked up and playing on the practice squad for most of the year, fumbling Fitzgerald Toussaint. Still not that upset about him. They had other opportunities to win that game, but you're playing a great offense against a great defense. The Denver Broncos got to the Super Bowl with one of the worst quarterback play statistics. It's the worst quarterback play overall in a season that any team has ever had and gotten into and won a Super Bowl. Is the no-fly zone that important? He's comparing players like Chris Harris, who didn't give up a touchdown for 2 seasons. Well, guess what happened when he faced Antonio Brown? If the Steelers have Antonio Brown in the playoff game, there's probably a whole different story. I don't think you could get hung up on nicknames. You take a look at the Carolina Panthers, and before the season even started, this is a team that won their division the previous year with a losing record. They were going to lose their sack leader, one of their top defenders in Greg Hardy. They let him go. He had domestic abuse problems. He was going to miss a large part of the season anyway, and the Dallas Cowboys are more than thrilled to sign criminals to their team. So when you look at it that way, and then the Panthers come out and have the season that they had and only lose 1 game in the regular season, why doesn't anybody give the Steelers just as much credit? When you look at it, a fumble away from beating the eventual Super Bowl champions and themselves playing in the AFC Championship and missing a multitude of players on offense, what would it be like this time around? Now that the Denver Broncos don't even have Peyton Manning or Brock Osweiler. Look at the first meeting against the Denver Broncos. And it's a tale of 2 halves, but the Steelers cranked it up. And one of the callers calls in and he wants to tell us about, still talking about the great defenses. And, well, the Steelers had a lot of sacks and they had some turnovers. What do you think the Denver Broncos did? The Steelers were in the top 5 in turnovers, so were the Denver Broncos. I think the Broncos were number 1, and not only that, they were the top scoring defense. And the Carolina Panthers were right up in that category too. The Steelers are in that category. So what could go wrong that they're in that category? They're getting sacks, they're getting turnovers, they're scoring on the defensive side of the ball, but they're 30th in passing. And I'm going to look at it that the Steelers are going to be one piece away on this defense from being a very significant player. And a lot of us feel that's going to be another defensive lineman, maybe a nose tackle, because they still haven't really pursued Steve McClendon. And usually you could get an indication of how the team's going to do in the draft based on the holes they don't fill in free agency. Nose tackle, defensive end to help spell Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt, that's another one. And then, of course, a safety, because Will Allen's still floating out there. And, I thought Will Allen was serviceable, but they could upgrade at that position. But you take a look at the other corner, one that played a lot of snaps this season was Antoine Blake. And this is tough because I don't like being negative on my own team or any of its players, but when Antoine Blake gives up a quarter of all the passing yards. I think the Steelers were something around like 4,200, 4,300 passing yards they gave up. And Antoine Blake gave up over 1,000, almost close to 1,100 passing yards himself, and 28 missed tackles. If you're generous enough to even say, well, we'll go back a little bit here. Pro Football Focus ranked Antoine Blake near the bottom. I think there may have only been one corner that they ranked worse than Antoine Blake, and that was Brandon Browner, and we all know how bad he was out there. So if you were to take anybody in the league, even an average player, if you take anyone in the league, even an average player, and substitute them in for Antoine Blake, and they give up maybe only half the yards that Antoine Blake gives up, all of a sudden the Steelers aren't 30th. They give up about 600 less passing yards, and they're in the middle of the pack when it comes to passing defense and yards given up. That is a very significant statistic to look at, and we can't always look at numbers. It would certainly help if Antoine Blake didn't miss 28 tackles as well. But who are the Steelers losing on defense versus who's coming back? Remember, Denver Broncos got to where they are being one of the top teams in turnovers, one of the top teams in defensive scoring, and the Steelers weren't far behind them. And the difference being, the Denver Broncos had horrible quarterback play. They got there with Peyton Manning throwing the most interceptions that in a span of games that he's ever done in his entire career. Obviously, the worst career statistically he had on paper. They didn't have a running game. And they've gotten to the Super Bowl, and they won the Super Bowl. So what happens when you have the Pittsburgh Steelers with Big Ben, Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, Martavis Bryant, Marcus Wheaton, and now you have Ladarius Green and even Jesse James, who's a capable wide receiver? How are you going to cover all of those guys? There isn't enough boom in a Legion of Boom, or enough no-fly in a no-fly zone to account for all of the weapons that the Pittsburgh Steelers have. So when a lot of people get emotionally hung up on wanting to sign a cornerback or sign a safety, there's only so many roster spots left. And I really, truly believe in my heart that this team is a piece away. If that's an Eric Weddle, that's fantastic. But in Eric Weddle, you cannot make the comparison to his former teammate, Ladarius Green, with the Chargers and say, hey, you know what? Some of that money could have went to Eric Weddle. Eric Weddle is going to be making $10 million a year. Ladarius Green is making somewhere between $4.5 to $5 million a season, not accounting for the signing bonus, of course. And the Steelers have a very friendly contract, so if this doesn't really work out this year, they could cut ties with him and move elsewhere. But in the meantime, if it does work out, this could turn out to be one of the more significant signings of not only this free agency period for the Steelers, but the entire NFL. You imagine, I mean, Heath Miller, somewhere pedestrian numbers, 50 to 60 catches, 2 touchdowns, about 500-600 yards. That's what Ladarius Green had as a backup in San Diego. A backup. I think you're looking at a significant upgrade and another piece that's going to help put a Lombardi trophy in the case. The stairway to 7. I think we're on our way. One piece away. How are they going to cover Ladarius Green? The Steelers stay healthy. Not only is their offense going to be unstoppable, I think they're going to have one heck of a defense. For that reason, I feel that the Steelers are going to have a tremendous year, and that you can't compare apples to oranges in terms of the bargain in value between signing a player like Ladarius Green and saying he was an unnecessary luxury, and maybe going after a player that might be on the backside of his career, costing at least twice as much more in an Eric Weddle. Steelers are one piece away. And then you could call them whatever you want. Steel Curtain, Blitzburg, or Super Bowl champions.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.